Beneath the gleaming floor of a luxury restaurant, in a suffocating underground bunker filled with forced laborers, my son looked straight at me and cold-bloodedly muttered, "Reduce this old man's rations. He'll only learn to be obedient and work when he's starving." My chest tightened at his brutality. Feeling no fear, I calmly raised my hand and fiercely ripped the tattered disguise off my face to reveal my true authority. That act of uncovering the truth inside this very den left everyone astonished. You are watching Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm so grateful for your presence here. Let's build our community. Tell me your city or country in the comments below. Where is this story reaching you today? Please note some fictional elements are added for entertainment and educational value. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the core lesson is vital for you. I have built things in my life that outlasted storms. I built Coal Dominion Holdings from a single warehouse in Bridgeport, Connecticut, back when I was 32 years old, with blisters on both palms and a loan I wasn't sure I could repay. I built it through recessions and market crashes and 2 rounds of litigation that nearly stripped me down to nothing. I built it for 40 years, and then I built it some more because that is what men like me do. We build. We do not stop until there is nothing left to build. I am 70 years old now. My hair went white somewhere around 60. My knees remind me every morning that I am not the man I was, and the penthouse on the 41st floor of the Coal Tower feels on most evenings far too large for one person. My wife Catherine passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 41 days from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand through every one of those 41 days, and when it was over, I poured everything I had left into the company, because work was the only language I still knew how to speak. Adrian was supposed to inherit all of it. My son, 42 years old. Sharp as glass, polished as a boardroom presentation, and charming in the way that expensive things are charming effortlessly and without warmth. I told myself for years that the coldness was efficiency, that men who run empires cannot afford sentiment. I had been cold myself at times. I understood it. What I did not understand until 3 days ago was the file. It came across my desk on a Tuesday morning, flagged by my private accounting firm as a routine quarterly audit discrepancy. I almost handed it to my assistant to forward to legal. Something stopped me. Maybe it was the number itself, a revenue figure for Adrian's restaurant division that had grown by nearly 500% in 14 months. In the hospitality industry, during a period when every other restaurant group in the Northeast was struggling to break even. I sat down with that file, and I did not get up for 4 hours. The restaurant chain, Adrian's Crown Jewel, 12 locations across 3 states, all of them gleaming and reviewed in every magazine that mattered, showed labor costs of almost zero. Not reduced, not optimized. Zero. Payroll records listed fewer than 40 employees across all 12 locations, all of them management-level salaried staff. No kitchen workers, no floor staff, no dishwashers, no prep cooks, no bussers. According to the official books, those restaurants ran themselves. The revenue was being funneled through a company called Meridian Staffing Solutions, registered in Delaware. No physical office, no website, no verifiable employees of its own. Just a name on paper and a bank account in a state that asked very few questions. I called Marcus into my office. He has been with me for 22 years. Marcus Webb, 53, built like a man who used to do things with his hands before he learned how to do them with his head, and loyal in the quiet way that cannot be bought and cannot be manufactured. He closed the door behind him without being asked, which meant he already knew something was wrong. "How long have you known?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "Known what, sir?" "Don't." I turned the file toward him across the desk. "How long?" Marcus sat down slowly. He looked at the numbers the way a man looks at something he hoped he would never have to explain. "I found an irregularity 6 weeks ago," he said. "I wasn't certain what I was looking at. I started digging quietly. And then a woman came to the front gate yesterday morning." He folded his hands on top of the file. "Her name is Patricia Okafor. Her husband Dennis took a job at one of the warehouse distribution centers connected to the restaurant supply chain. That was 11 days ago. He hasn't come home." The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of an empty building, the quiet of a moment that changes the shape of everything that comes after it. "She filed a missing persons report?" I asked. "She tried. The responding officer told her adult men leave sometimes, that there was no evidence of foul play, that she should wait 72 hours. Marcus's jaw tightened. "She's been back 3 times. Nobody has followed up." I stood up and walked to the window. 41 floors below, the city moved through its Tuesday as if nothing had shifted. Taxis, delivery trucks, a woman walking a dog past the fountain in the plaza. Ordinary Tuesday things. My son's name was on the building across the street. The new restaurant flagship opened 8 months ago, $40 entrees, and a sommelier who had been written up in the New Yorker. I had attended the opening. I had stood beside Adrian and shaken hands and smiled for photographs. "I want to bring this to the FBI," I said. "If we do that," Marcus said carefully, "and if Adrian has people inside any part of the investigative chain, the evidence disappears. The distribution centers get cleared out before anyone arrives. Dennis Okafor and whoever else is in there never surfaces." I turned from the window. "You think he has people inside?" "I think a man who can run an operation this size without it appearing in any public record for over a year has thought carefully about every possible exit." Marcus met my eyes. "I think the only way in is from the inside." I heard what he was not saying. "You're not suggesting that I—" "No," he said quickly. "Absolutely not. I was going to say we find someone credible, someone with no connection to Cold Dominion, someone who—" "Marcus." I picked up the file. The last outside person we trusted with something sensitive was Gerald Hatch, and Gerald Hatch billed us $400,000 and then sold the information to our competitor. I set the file back down. "I'm 70 years old. I have nothing to lose that I haven't already decided to give away." I looked at him. "And I am the one man on earth that Adrian cannot buy." Marcus stared at me for a long moment. Then he put both hands flat on the desk and exhaled through his nose, the slow, measured exhale of a man choosing his battles. "If you go in," he said, "you go in with a camera. You go in with a GPS locator I can track in real time. And you come out the moment I send the signal, no arguments, no delays." "Agreed." "And if something goes wrong, then you come in anyway," I said, "with everyone you need." He nodded once. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small card across the desk. A name, an address, a woman named Gloria who apparently specialized in theatrical prosthetics and asked no questions for the right fee. I picked up the card. 40 years ago, I walked into a warehouse in Bridgeport with blisters on my hands and built something from nothing. Tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into my son's empire with dirt on my face and find out what he had built instead. Gloria Hutchins worked out of a converted row house on Delancey Street, the kind of neighborhood that had been 3 different things in the last 30 years and hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be next. I arrived at 7:15 in the morning before the street had fully woken up. Marcus had dropped me 2 blocks away and was parked where I could not see him, which was the arrangement we had agreed upon. If someone was watching me, and I had to assume someone was always watching, because Adrian had not built what he built by being careless, then I needed to arrive alone. Gloria opened the door before I knocked. She was somewhere in her 60s, small and precise with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair, and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen stranger things than a 70-year-old billionaire standing on her doorstep at dawn. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Just Richard," I said, "for the foreseeable future." She studied my face the way a sculptor studies a block of marble, not admiring it, assessing it. "Come in." I made coffee. Her workroom was in the back behind a kitchen that smelled of strong coffee and linseed oil. Photographs covered one entire wall, actors mostly in various states of transformation. A young man made to look 80, a woman whose face had been restructured entirely for what looked like a film production. A bald man given a full head of hair so convincingly that I looked twice to confirm the before and after were the same person. "Sit," Gloria said, nodding toward a barber's chair positioned under a ring of professional lighting. "Tell me what you need." "I need to be invisible," I said. "Not unrecognizable, invisible. The kind of man people look past." She pulled on latex gloves with a sharp snap. "Age, add 15 years, maybe more." "Build story," she said. It was not a question, but I understood it as one. "Homeless. Long-term. Someone who has been outside long enough that the outside has gotten inside him." I paused. "Someone who wouldn't look out of place at a labor pickup spot on the south side of the city." Gloria nodded slowly and began pulling trays from a cabinet, silicone compounds, adhesives, pigments in shades I could not have named. She worked without speaking for a long time, and I sat in the chair and let her watching in the mirror as Richard Cole was methodically disassembled. The prosthetic work took 90 minutes. Deep lines carved into the corners of my eyes and mouth. A thin scar along my jawline that caught the light like something old and forgotten. My natural white hair was thinned further with a product that made it look unwashed and uncut for months. She darkened the skin beneath my eyes, hollowed my cheeks slightly with contour pigment, and added a gray stubble that was just uneven enough to look unintentional. Then came the clothes. Marcus had sourced them from 3 different donation bins across the city: a brown canvas jacket with a fraying collar, work pants 2 sizes too large, belted with a strip of electrical cord boots, with the left sole beginning to separate at the toe. The jacket had been treated with a mixture that Gloria apparently kept specifically for this purpose, something that produced the smell of long-term outdoor living without being so overpowering as to cause people to step back. "The camera," I said. She held up what appeared to be a standard plastic button, dull brown, slightly mismatched from the others on the jacket. 12 hours of recording," she said. "The feed transmits to an encrypted receiver within a 300-foot radius. Beyond that, it stores locally." She pressed it carefully into place on the second buttonhole from the top. "Do not touch it. Do not look down at it. Pretend it does not exist." "And the GPS?" She handed me what looked like a strip of medical adhesive tape. "Goes on the inside of your left forearm. Waterproof. The signal is low frequency, designed to pass through most interference." She met my eyes in the mirror. "Most, not all." I noted the distinction. When she was finished, I stood and turned to face the mirror fully for the first time. The man looking back at me was not Richard Cole. He was thinner somehow, despite the padding in the jacket. Older. His eyes carried the particular flatness of someone who had stopped expecting things to improve. He stood with a slight forward lean, not a stoop exactly, but a posture that said the world had been pressing down on him for a long time, and he had simply adjusted. I had built an empire. This man had been worn down by one. "You'll need a name," Gloria said behind me. "Rick," I said. "Rick Harlan." She nodded. Then she looked at me with an expression that was almost maternal. "How long do you plan to be him?" "As long as it takes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The men who come to me for work like this, the legitimate work, the actors and the film people, they always say the same thing when they put on a face like that one." She began cleaning her brushes. "They say it feels like putting on someone else's pain." I looked at myself one more time in the mirror. "Good," I said. "That's exactly what I need it to feel like." I walked out of Gloria's row house on Delancey Street at 9:15 in the morning. The autumn air hit me differently than it had on the way in, colder, less forgiving, the kind of cold that settles into clothing that isn't quite warm enough. 2 blocks east on the corner of Halsted and Meridian, there was a labor pickup location that Marcus had identified in his research, an unofficial gathering spot where day laborers waited for work vans, no paperwork, no questions, cash at the end of the shift. Meridian Staffing Solutions had been recruiting from exactly this corner for the past 7 months. I put my hands in my pockets and walked toward it. Rick Harlan was going to find work today, and Richard Cole was going to find out exactly what that work looked like from the inside. The corner of Halsted and Meridian at 9:30 in the morning looked exactly like what it was, a place where desperation and opportunity had learned to find each other without making a fuss about it. 14 men were already gathered when I arrived. They stood in loose clusters near the chain-link fence that bordered a vacant lot, some drinking coffee from paper cups, some just standing with their hands deep in their pockets and their shoulders pulled up against the October chill. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody introduced themselves. This was not that kind of place. I took a position near the far end of the fence away from the main cluster, and I watched. The men ranged in age from maybe 25 to somewhere near my own years. Most wore the practical uniform of outdoor labor, heavy boots, canvas jackets, work gloves tucked into waistbands. A few had backpacks. One man, heavy-set and somewhere in his mid-50s, was reading a folded newspaper with the focused attention of someone who had learned to make small things last. He glanced up when I approached, assessed me in roughly 2 seconds, and went back to his paper. "First time," he said without looking up again. "That obvious? You're standing too far from the fence." He turned a page. "Van stops on the street side. You want to be visible from the street, not from the lot. Move up." I moved up. His name, I would learn over the next 20 minutes, was Walter Briggs. 61 years old, former maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant in Rockford, Illinois, laid off 18 months ago when the plant consolidated operations. He had come to the city chasing a rumor of steady work and had found this corner instead. He was not bitter about it, or if he was, he had filed it somewhere that did not interfere with his mornings. "Meridian van comes 3 times a week," Walter said, still reading. "Tuesday, Thursday, sometimes Saturday. They take 6, maybe 8. Pay is $30 cash for a full shift. No paperwork, no questions about your status, no nothing." He finally looked at me. "You got a record?" "No. Doesn't matter either way. They don't check." He folded his newspaper and tucked it under his arm. "They also don't tell you exactly where you're going until you're in the van. You okay with that?" I had been okay with considerably more uncomfortable arrangements in my life, though none of them had required quite this particular kind of faith. "I'm okay with that," I said. The van arrived at 10 minutes to 10. It was a white cargo van, clean but unremarkable, with no company markings on the outside, just a standard commercial plate and tinted rear windows. The driver was a man in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a gray zip-up jacket, and an expression that suggested he had made this particular drive enough times to find it thoroughly uninteresting. He stepped out, counted heads, and held up 8 fingers. "8 today," he said. "Line up." The men moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. I fell in behind Walter. The driver looked at each man briefly as they climbed in, not checking anything specific, just looking the way someone looks when they are trying to determine whether a face is familiar or unfamiliar. When he got to me, he paused for half a second longer than he had with the others. My chest tightened. I held his gaze without expression and waited. He moved on. The inside of the van had 2 bench seats running along either wall. No windows except the front windshield, which we could see partially through the gap between the front seats. I counted the route, instinctively old habit from years of navigating the city, and tracked our direction as best I could. We went south on Meridian east on Callaway, then a long stretch that crossed under the elevated rail line before turning into what felt like a commercial district. Warehouses, loading docks, the kind of blocks that existed to serve other blocks and expected no attention in return. Walter sat across from me. He was watching the other men the way experienced travelers watch their fellow passengers, not intrusively, just with the calm awareness of someone keeping track of his surroundings. "You ever done warehouse work?" he asked quietly. "Some," I said. In truth, I had not touched a warehouse floor in 40 years, but I had built enough of them to know the vocabulary. "Physical," he said. "Harder than it looks. And Meridian—" He paused, chose his words. "Meridian runs a tight operation. You keep your head down, you do what the supervisor says, you don't ask questions that aren't about the work itself." He looked at me steadily. "You understand what I mean when I say that?" "I understand." He nodded and looked away. The van stopped after 31 minutes. I had counted. When the rear doors opened, we were in an underground loading bay accessed through a ramp. I had felt, but not seen, a long descent that had taken us beneath street level. The bay was lit with industrial fluorescence that turned every face the same pallid color. The ceiling was low. The air smelled of concrete and something faintly chemical like industrial cleaning solution that had been used on surfaces too many times. A man was waiting for us at the far end of the bay. He was broad and unhurried, somewhere in his mid-40s, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness that did not come from calm, but from confidence in his own authority. He wore dark work clothes and a laminated badge on a lanyard that I could not read from this distance. He looked at the 8 of us the way a foreman looks at a delivery, counting, assessing, deciding. "Welcome to Meridian," he said. His voice carried without effort. "My name is Gavin. You work for me today. You do what I say when I say it. You have a problem, you bring it to me. You do not talk to other workers about personal matters. You do not use your phone. You do not wander." He let that settle for a moment. Clear. Nobody said anything. Which was, I was learning, exactly the right answer. Gavin's eyes moved along the line and stopped on me. "You," he said. "How old are you?" "Old enough to work," I said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite suspicion. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds before moving on. I breathed slowly and kept my hands loose at my sides. Somewhere above us, $40 entrees were being plated in a gleaming kitchen. And somewhere in this building, I was almost certain Dennis Okafor was still waiting to go home. Gavin did not give tours. He assigned stations the way a man deals cards, quick, without sentiment, without explanation. 2 men went to a receiving area near the loading dock. 3 others disappeared through a heavy door at the far end of the bay that required a keypad code Gavin entered with his body blocking the panel. Walter was directed toward a section stacked with supply crates, and I was pointed toward a long industrial sink running the length of the eastern wall beside a heavy-set man who had arrived before us and was already working without having been told to. "Prep station," Gavin said to me and walked away. I looked at the sink, at the industrial trays. at the racks of commercial cookware stacked along the wall behind it, and I understood with a clarity that settled coldly in my chest exactly what I was looking at. This was the kitchen that fed the restaurant above, not a separate facility, not a contracted supplier. The same building, the same structure connected by freight elevators I could now see at both ends of the room, the finished food going up, the clean equipment, coming back down the whole operation, running on labor that did not appear in any payroll record because the people performing it did not officially exist. The man beside me at the prep station had not looked up when I arrived. He was working with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste energy on anything that wasn't directly in front of him. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad-shouldered with the kind of hands that had been doing physical work for years, knuckles enlarged palms, calloused movements precise despite visible exhaustion. "Rick," I said quietly, using the name like a key I was still learning to fit into the lock. "Just started." He glanced at me sideways, assessed, returned to his work. "Dennis," he said. The name hit me like cold water to the face. I kept my expression neutral through an act of will that cost me more than I expected. Dennis Okafor, 37 years old, Patricia's husband, 11 days. The man whose wife had stood outside the gates of my building and begged someone to listen. He was standing 18 inches away from me, alive, exhausted, and apparently unaware that anyone had been looking for him. "How long have you been here?" I asked, keeping my voice low and conversational, the kind of question one stranger asks another to pass the time. Dennis's jaw tightened slightly. "You don't ask that," he said. Not harshly, just factually, the way someone states a rule they learned through experience. "Sorry," I said. He said nothing more for several minutes. I worked beside him and let the silence do what it needed to do, watching the room from my peripheral vision, while my hands stayed busy with the task in front of me. The facility was larger than the loading bay had suggested. Through a wide archway to my left, I could see a second chamber, lower ceilinged, lined with what appeared to be storage shelving and folding cots pushed against the walls. Men moved in and out of that space with the unhurried resignation of people who had stopped counting days. I counted 11 visible from where I stood. Added the 3 who had gone through the keypad door, Walter, the 2 at the loading dock, Dennis and myself. That was 19. The actual number was almost certainly higher. Gavin moved through the room at irregular intervals, never on a schedule, never predictable. He did not speak unless he was correcting something. When he corrected something, he stood close enough that the person being corrected could not look away without it becoming a statement. It was a specific technique. I had seen versions of it in boardrooms deployed by men who understood that physical proximity was its own form of pressure. I had used it myself once or twice in a different life. The thought made me feel something unpleasant that I did not have a clean name for. Around noon, a cart was wheeled out from the back, sandwiches in plastic wrap, water bottles, a folded paper towel for each man. The distribution was orderly and joyless. Dennis took his portion without comment, ate standing at the prep station, without stopping work, and finished in 4 minutes. I ate beside him and watched him the way I had learned to watch people, not staring, just absorbing. "Your family know where you are?" I asked as quietly as I could manage. Dennis's hands stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds. Then they started again. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I have family too," I said. "And if I disappeared, I'd want someone to know I was okay." He turned and looked at me directly for the first time. His eyes were the eyes of a man carrying something very heavy, not broken, but bent considerably by the weight. He studied my face with an intensity that made me aware suddenly of Gloria's prosthetics, in a way I hadn't been since I'd left Delancey Street. "You're not going to be able to help me," he said. The words were not accusatory. They were simply the conclusion a reasonable man had reached after 11 days of evidence. "Maybe not today," I said. Something shifted in his expression, not hope exactly, but the faint recognition of a possibility he had stopped allowing himself to consider. He looked away before it could become anything more than that. Across the room, Gavin's head turned in our direction. I picked up the next item from the tray and went back to work, keeping my movements steady, keeping my breathing even, keeping Rick Harlan exactly where he needed to be. But my mind was already moving ahead, calculating mapping, counting exits and freight elevators and keypad doors and the distance between where I was standing and whatever was behind that heavy door at the far end of the bay. I had found Dennis Okafor, which meant everything Adrian had built down here was real, and everything I had allowed myself to hope was a misunderstanding, a clerical error, a coincidence, an explanation that didn't require my son to be the man I had spent the last 3 days afraid he had become was gone. There was no misunderstanding. There was only what was in front of me and what I was going to do about it. The afternoon shift moved the way slow water moves, without urgency, without variation, with a steadiness that wore at you not through intensity but through repetition. I had worked hard in my life. Built things, carried things, stayed at a desk, through nights that ended in mornings that didn't feel like mornings. But the work in that underground facility was a different kind of hard. It was the kind that asked nothing of your mind and everything of your body, and left you no room to be anything other than the motion you were performing. Stack this. Move that. Repeat. The fluorescent lights above never changed. There were no windows to tell you whether it was 2 in the afternoon or 7 at night. Time became something you measured in the ache of your lower back and the number of times the freight elevator had gone up and come back down. I counted. It had gone up 11 times since I arrived. Dennis worked beside me through the afternoon without volunteering anything further. But he watched me. I could feel it, the sideways attention of a man recalibrating his assessment of someone he had already decided wasn't worth trusting. I did not push. I had learned over 40 years of negotiations that silence used correctly was more persuasive than any argument. Around 2 in the afternoon, Walter appeared at my elbow. "You're holding your shoulders wrong," he said quietly, positioning himself beside me at the prep station, as if he had been assigned there all along. "You look like a man who's used to sitting at a desk. In here, that's the kind of thing Gavin notices." I consciously adjusted my posture, rolling my shoulders forward slightly, letting my spine curve with the particular tiredness of someone who had been doing this for years rather than hours. "Better," Walter said. He picked up the work in front of him and continued in the same low, unhurried voice. "You were looking at the elevator." "Just watching," I said. "Don't." He did not look at me. "The cameras cover that corner. Gavin reviews the feed every evening. Men who watch the elevator make him curious, and curious Gavin is a problem nobody needs." I filed that information precisely where it belonged, not just as a warning, but as data. There were cameras. Gavin reviewed them personally, which meant the camera in my button was not the only recording happening in this room. "How many cameras?" I asked. Walter's hands paused for less than a second. "You ask a lot of questions for a first day. I'm trying to understand the environment." He was quiet for a moment. Then, without changing his expression or his rhythm, "4 that I've found. 2 in this room, 1 in the corridor, toward the back, 1 in the loading bay. There may be others I haven't located." He glanced at me briefly. "Why does a man who just started need to know that—" I met his eyes. "Same reason you counted them." Something shifted in Walter's face, a small recalibration, the look of a man who has just revised his estimate of a situation. He did not ask anything further. At 3:15, the keypad door at the far end of the room opened. I had been waiting for this without letting myself appear to wait for it. The door swung outward heavy, reinforced the kind that absorbed sound rather than just blocking it. Through the opening before it swung shut again, behind the man who came through, I saw enough. A longer corridor, more fluorescent light, the edge of what appeared to be a second, larger room, and in the corridor itself along the wall, a row of narrow cots with blankets folded at the foot of each one. The man who came through was in his mid-20s, slight moving with the careful economy of someone managing discomfort he had decided not to acknowledge. He took a position at the station across from me and began working without any preamble. Dennis beside me did not look up, but his jaw tightened. "That's David," he said very quietly, in a tone that carried everything he wasn't saying. "He's been here longer than most." "How long?" Dennis set down the item in his hands and picked up the next one. "Long enough that he doesn't talk about before anymore." He said it the way you say something that is both a fact and a warning. That's what this place does eventually. It makes befores it seem like something that happened to someone else. The words landed in a way that had nothing to do with Rick Harlan and everything to do with Richard Cole. Because I thought of Catherine suddenly, unexpectedly, with the sharp clarity that grief sometimes produces without warning. I thought of the way she used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was stop believing their own life had a before worth returning to. I thought of what it meant that my son had built a place specifically designed to make people forget theirs. "You have family?" I asked Dennis. The question came out quieter than I intended. Dennis was still for a moment. Then he said, "A wife, but Patricia." His voice changed on her name, not breaking, but softening in the way that names do when they belong to someone you are afraid you might not see again. "And a daughter. She just turned 4. I kept my hands moving. I kept my breathing even. I kept Rick Harlan exactly where he needed to be, but something tightened in my chest that I knew from experience would not loosen for a very long time. "She knows you're okay?" I asked. "She knows I'm alive," Dennis said. "I got a message out through one of the drivers 3 weeks ago. Told her I was working. Told her not to call the police." He paused. "I don't know if she listened." She hadn't. She had come to my building and stood outside my gate and begged someone, anyone, to help her find her husband. She had found the wrong man, and he had turned out to be exactly the right one. I pressed my left forearm gently against my side, feeling the faint outline of the GPS strip beneath my sleeve. Marcus was out there. I just needed to give him something to find. At 4 o'clock, Gavin called a water break. It lasted exactly 7 minutes. I knew because I counted the same way I had been counting everything since I arrived. Elevator trips, camera positions, the number of men in each room, the intervals between Gavin's walkthroughs. In a place designed to make you stop thinking, the only resistance available was to keep thinking harder. The men drank from paper cups near the loading dock. Some sat on the floor with their backs against the wall. Nobody talked much. The silence was not companionable. It was the silence of people who had learned that conversation drew attention, and attention in this place was rarely a good thing. I positioned myself near the freight elevator, facing slightly away from the camera Walter had identified in the northeast corner. I pressed my left forearm against my ribs, feeling the GPS strip pulse faintly, or perhaps I was only imagining the pulse the way you imagine a heartbeat when you press your hand to your own chest in a quiet room. Then I made a decision. I reached up slowly, as if adjusting my collar against the cold, and pressed the second button from the top of my jacket firmly for 2 full seconds. Gloria had said 2 seconds steady pressure to begin active transmission. The button did not beep. It did not light up. It did nothing that could be seen or heard by anyone in that room. But somewhere in the circuitry, behind that dull brown button, something began a quiet, patient recording of everything in front of me, transmitting in fragments to the receiver in Marcus's vehicle, 300 feet above, storing the rest locally, against the moment the signal found its way through. I lowered my hand and drank my water. 7 minutes ended. Gavin said, "Back to stations," and the room reorganized itself without complaint. At 5:30, the freight elevator came down, carrying 2 men I hadn't seen before. Restaurant staff judging by their clothing, coming to retrieve a rack of prepared items. They did not look at the workers in the room. They moved to the rack, loaded what they needed onto a wheeled cart, pressed the elevator button, and went back up. The whole exchange took less than 4 minutes. The men in the room watched them go the way people watch something they have decided not to want. Dennis was watching too. His hands had stopped moving for the duration of those 4 minutes, and I could see the effort it took him to start them again. "They come down every evening," he said without being asked. "Around this time. Sometimes twice." "Do they ever talk to anyone down here?" "No." A single word carrying the full weight of what it meant that the answer was no. I thought about the $40 entrees, about the sommelier, about the review in the New Yorker, about every person who had sat in one of those gleaming dining rooms and eaten food prepared in a room they did not know existed by people whose names were not in any record. I thought about the opening night 8 months ago, Adrian beside me, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. I thought about how proud I had been. Not of the restaurant specifically, but of him, of what I had taken to be evidence that the son I raised had built something of his own on his own terms, in his own right. The pride felt like something I wanted to return now, like a gift given based on false information. At 6:15, a man 2 stations down from me knocked over a rack of commercial sheet trays. The sound was enormous in the low-ceilinged space, a cascading crash that sent every person in the room rigid with the particular alertness of people who have learned that loud, unexpected sounds produce consequences. Gavin was across the room in seconds. The man on the floor, young somewhere in his early 20s, scrambling to collect the trays with shaking hands, looked up at Gavin with an expression that made something tighten painfully behind my sternum. It was not the expression of an employee who had made a mistake. It was the expression of someone calculating in real time how serious the consequences of that mistake were going to be. "Stand up," Gavin said. The young man stood. His hands were still shaking. "What is your number?" Gavin asked. Not his name. His number. The young man said 14. Gavin looked at the trays on the floor, then at the young man. Then he took out a small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote something down with the methodical calm of a person who had developed a system for exactly this kind of moment. 14, he said again, as if confirming a notation. "That rack goes on your account." "Sir, I didn't—" "Your account," Gavin said again pleasantly, the way you repeat something to a child who hasn't understood yet. "You'll work it off." He put the notebook away and walked back toward the center of the room without hurrying. The young man stood very still for a moment, his jaw working silently, his hands clenched at his sides. Then he bent down and began stacking the trays. I watched and did not move and did not speak because Rick Harlan would not have moved or spoken, and I needed to be Rick Harlan for a while longer. But inside the jacket against my ribs, the button was recording everything. And I thought, account. He said account, which meant there was a ledger somewhere. A record of debts assigned to numbers rather than names, a paper architecture of obligation, designed to keep men in a place they had never agreed to stay. I needed to find that ledger. Walter appeared at my shoulder so quietly that I nearly startled. "You saw that," he said. It was not a question. "I saw it," I said. He was quiet for a moment, then very low. "His name is David. He's been here 43 days. I looked at him. "I've been keeping count," Walter said simply. "For all of them. Someone should." The end of the shift was not announced. It simply arrived. Gavin appeared in the center of the room at 7:45 and said, "Stations down," and the men stopped what they were doing with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned not to linger. The routine that followed told me more about this place than anything I had witnessed during the working hours. Men moved toward the far corridor in groups of 3 and 4, collecting thin blankets from a shelf near the keypad door, which stood open, now held by a rubber wedge revealing the longer hallway and the rows of cots I had glimpsed earlier. A second man I hadn't seen before, younger than Gavin and less interested in projecting authority, distributed small packages: crackers, a piece of dried fruit, a single-serve container of peanut butter. Dinner, such as it was, nobody complained. That was the part that settled most heavily in my chest, not the inadequacy of the food, not the narrowness of the cots, not the low ceiling of the back room pressing down on men who deserved open sky. It was the absence of complaint. These men had been here long enough that this had become normal, and normal, once established, is the hardest thing in the world to resist. I took my blanket and my crackers and followed Walter to a pair of cots near the eastern wall, far enough from the main cluster that conversation was possible, close enough that isolation wouldn't draw attention. Walter sat on the edge of his cot and opened the peanut butter with the methodical patience of a man rationing something he knew he needed to make last. He did not speak immediately, and I had learned enough about him in the past 9 hours to understand that his silences were not empty. "The ledger," I said quietly. He glanced at me. "You remembered that." "I remember everything." He studied me for a moment, with the particular attention he had been giving me all day, reassessing, recalibrating. "Gavin keeps it in the office," he said. "Back corridor, third door. He locks it at night. Combination padlock, 4 digits. He paused. "I've seen him open it twice. The combination starts with a 1. "How do you know that?" "Because I watch," Walter said simply. "Same reason I know there are 23 men in this facility right now, that David has been here the longest, at 43 days, that the freight elevator runs on a timed cycle that leaves a 6-minute window between trips, and that the camera in the back corridor goes dark for approximately 90 seconds every time the main circuit overloads, which happens around 9 in the evening, when they run the industrial dishwashers upstairs at full capacity." I looked at him. He looked back at me with the level steadiness of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for some time. "I was a maintenance supervisor for 28 years, he said. "I understand systems. I understand how they fail." He tilted his head slightly. "What I have not understood until today is why a man with hands that have never done this kind of work is asking questions that only matter if you're planning something." The moment had arrived. I had known it would have felt it building all afternoon in the careful space Walter maintained around his observations. I looked at this man, 61 years old, laid off from a plant in Rockford, Illinois, eating crackers on a cot in an underground room, and I made a decision. "My name is not Rick," I said. Walter did not react visibly. He finished opening the peanut butter. "I know," he said. "You know. I've known since this morning." He spread peanut butter on a cracker with the unhurried focus of someone performing a familiar task. "You adjusted your posture when I told you to. Nobody who has actually spent years working physically adjusts their posture on instruction. It's too ingrained. He ate the cracker. Also, your hands. The calluses are wrong for the rest of the story. I exhaled slowly. I can get everyone out of here, I said. But I need the ledger, and I need what's on the other side of that keypad door. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Across the room, Dennis had settled onto a cot and was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling with the focused blankness of a man visiting somewhere else in his mind. David sat cross-legged on his cot, turning the small peanut butter container over and over in his hands without opening it. There's a man named Jonathan in the back room, Walter said. Older than you. He's been here 19 days. He doesn't talk about why he was targeted specifically, but the others say Gavin's people came for him directly, not from the corner pickup, but from his home address. He looked at me. That's different from the rest of us. That means someone wanted him here in particular. Jonathan. The name landed without context, but the detail around it targeted specifically home address. Someone wanted him here sent a cold current through my thinking that I could not immediately explain. Which cot? I asked. Walter nodded toward the back corridor. Third on the left. He's the one who's been covering for the others when Gavin runs the evening count. Takes the extra marks on his own account, so the younger ones don't accumulate debt faster. He paused. He's been doing it since his second day. Something about that landed differently than it should have for Rick Harlan. For Richard Cole, it landed like a question I needed to answer before morning. I lay back on my cot and stared at the pipes running across the ceiling, listening to the facility settle into its nighttime rhythms, the distant hum of the dishwashers, above the occasional footstep of Gavin, making his rounds, the slow, uneven breathing of 23 men who deserved better than this room. At 9 o'clock, I heard a faint flicker in the fluorescent lights above a barely perceptible dimming that lasted no more than 3 seconds before the system stabilized. The circuit overload Walter had described. 90 seconds of darkness in the back corridor camera. I pressed my forearm against my ribs and felt the GPS strip beneath my sleeve, and I thought tomorrow. Tomorrow I find Jonathan. Tomorrow I find the ledger. Tonight I needed to understand why someone had come for an old man at his home address. Sleep did not come. I lay on the narrow cot and listened to the facility breathe around me, the distant mechanical hum of equipment running above the occasional shift and murmur of men dreaming whatever men dream when they are in a place like this. The fluorescent lights in the main room had been dimmed to half power for the night, casting everything in a flat gray light that made the room feel like a photograph of itself, rather than a place where people actually lived. At 10:15, when Gavin's footsteps had made their last round and retreated to wherever Gavin went, when he was not managing his human inventory, I sat up. The back corridor was 15 feet away. Third cot on the left. I moved slowly, the way men move at night, in shared spaces, carefully, with the particular consideration of someone who understands that other people's sleep is a fragile and valuable thing. The corridor was narrow and darker than the main room, lit only by a single low-wattage bulb near the far end. The cots here were closer together. The men sleeping on them were almost without exception older than the workers in the main room. Third on the left. Jonathan Reeves was not asleep. He was lying on his back, with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had made his peace with not sleeping and was simply waiting for morning to decide to arrive. He was in his late 60s, lean, deliberate in his stillness, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now something better than handsome. Weathered, considered. The face of a man who had thought carefully about most things and made his decisions accordingly. He heard me coming and turned his head without alarm. "Third shift, man," he said quietly. It was not quite a greeting and not quite a question. "Can't sleep either," I said. He studied me with eyes that were sharper than his posture suggested. "You're the one Walter's been watching," he said. "I noticed this afternoon." "Walter watches everyone." "He watches everyone," Jonathan agreed. "But he watches you differently." He shifted slightly on the cot, making room in the conversation, if not on the narrow mattress. "Sit down before Gavin's man does his secondary check at 10:30. I sat on the edge of the adjacent cot and looked at him directly. "Someone came for you specifically," I said. "Not from the pickup corner, from your home." Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise but the recognition of a question he had been expecting. "You've been talking to Walter. He keeps count of things." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, with the particular cadence of a man choosing each word before releasing it. "I had a job," he said. "Before this. Maintenance work mostly. Odd jobs. Nothing that would make anyone notice me." He paused. "Then my daughter called me. She was upset. She told me she'd found something at her job that she wasn't supposed to find, and she was afraid, and she needed me to come." "What kind of job?" I asked. "Finance. Corporate accounting." He looked at the ceiling. "She's good with numbers. Always has been since she was small. Could look at a spreadsheet and find the thing that didn't belong the way other people find a face in a crowd." A quiet pride moved through his voice and then settled back down into careful stillness. "She found something that didn't belong. And then 3 days later, men came to my door and told me there was work available. Good pay cash, immediate start." He turned his head and looked at me. "I needed the money. I said yes. And then you were here." "And then I was here." He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. "I figured out the connection after the first week. That this was about Lily. That someone was keeping me here to keep her quiet." He exhaled slowly. "I don't know if it's working. I don't know if she's stayed quiet. I don't know anything about what's happening above ground except what I can hear through the ceiling when the kitchen gets loud." Lily. His daughter. I held the name, carefully turning it over, not yet letting him see what it meant to me. "Is she safe?" I asked. "I have to believe she is," he said. "Otherwise, what is the point of any of this?" The way he said it, not as a question, but as a statement of the arrangement he had made with himself to survive, made something tighten in my throat that I had to breathe through quietly. Then from somewhere above us came a sound I had not expected. Footsteps. Not the industrial rhythms of kitchen work or the flat tread of Gavin's rounds. These were the footsteps of someone moving with purpose through the upper level of the facility, the administrative section based on their direction at nearly 11 o'clock at night. And then a voice. Muffled by the ceiling, softened by distance, but unmistakable to someone who had known it for 61 years. "I just want to check the volunteer schedule for tomorrow. Adrian said I could come by any time." Every cell in my body went absolutely still, because the voice above me belonged to Sandra Cole, my sister. I pressed my hand flat against the floor of the cot to keep myself from standing up too quickly, because standing up too quickly would have been Rick Harlan acting like Richard Cole, and I could not afford that. Not yet, not here. Sandra was upstairs, in the administrative section, at 11 o'clock at night. Because Adrian had told her she could come by any time. She believed she was volunteering for a workforce development program. She had told me about it at dinner 2 months ago. Adrian's new initiative training opportunities for disadvantaged workers, Sandra helping with scheduling and outreach, because she had always been the one in our family who showed up when something needed doing. I had smiled and said it sounded like Adrian was finally giving back. I had been so proud. The footsteps above moved toward the far end of the administrative corridor and then stopped. A door opened and closed. Jonathan was watching me. "You know that voice," he said. It was not a question. I looked at him, this man who had been brought here because of his daughter, who had been absorbing debt on behalf of strangers, who had been staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning for 19 nights. "Yes," I said. "Someone you need to protect. Someone who doesn't know she needs protecting yet." Jonathan nodded slowly, with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what that meant. Then he reached under his thin mattress and produced something unexpected, a folded piece of paper, soft, with handling, covered in small, precise handwriting. "Names," he said quietly. "All 23. Days here. Account balances as best I could calculate from what I've overheard. Gavin's patterns. The camera blind spots." He held it toward me. "Walter keeps count in his head. I keep count on paper. We didn't know what we were going to do with it." He met my eyes. "But we both knew someone would come eventually." My hand was not entirely steady when I took it. Morning came the way mornings come in places without windows, not with light, but with noise. The dishwashers above cycled on at 6:15. The fluorescent lights returned to full power at 6:30. Gavin's footsteps crossed the main room at 6:45, steady and unhurried, the footsteps of a man who understood that his presence at a predictable time was itself a form of control. By 7, the men were at their stations and the facility had resumed its daylight rhythm, as if the night had not happened at all. I had not slept. I did not feel the absence of sleep the way I normally would have, the thick fog, the slow thinking, the body's complaint. Instead, I felt something cleaner and colder. The tightness of a man who has been given a job that matters and has not yet done it. Jonathan's folded paper was inside my left boot, pressed flat against the inner sole. I had memorized its contents in the dark, 23 names, 19 of them with account totals beside them, the rest still being calculated. Camera positions, Gavin's patterns, the 6-minute elevator window, the 90-second circuit overload at 9 p.m. It was the most important document I had held in 40 years of running a company, and it had been written on a piece of paper torn from the inside cover of a pocket Bible by a man sleeping on a cot in a basement. The morning shift passed without incident until 10:40. That was when the freight elevator descended with a different weight than usual. I heard it before I saw it. The elevator moved more slowly, when it carried more than equipment, and this time it came down with the deliberate pace of something significant. The doors opened. 2 men I had not seen before stepped out first, not workers, not Gavin's floor staff. They were dressed in dark clothing and moved with the particular efficiency of people whose job was to stand near other people and make sure nothing unexpected happened. And then Adrian Cole stepped out of the elevator. My son. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie collar open, the studied casualness of a man who wanted to project ease while exercising authority. He was 42 years old and looked in that moment exactly like the version of himself I had been most proud of, composed, intelligent, unhurried. The kind of man people trusted instinctively because he had learned somewhere along the way how to look like someone worth trusting. I lowered my head and kept my hands moving. The room changed when he entered it. Not dramatically, nobody stopped working. Nobody made a sound that they wouldn't have made anyway. But something shifted in the quality of attention. Men who had been working with the resigned efficiency of long habit became almost imperceptibly more careful, smaller, the way people become smaller when something large and unpredictable enters their space. Adrian walked the length of the room, slowly, hands in his pockets, looking at the stations with the assessing attention of someone reviewing an operation, rather than a place where human beings spent their days. He stopped near the prep station where Dennis and I were working. He looked at the output on the counter, the prepared items, the organized trays, the careful work of people who had no choice but to be careful. He nodded once, to no one in particular, just nodded. As if the work had met a standard he had set, and the people who produced it were simply the mechanism by which the standard was met. I had spent 40 years managing people. I had held thousands of performance reviews, walked hundreds of production floors, evaluated countless operations. I knew the difference between a leader who saw his people and one who saw his numbers. My son saw numbers. Gavin appeared at Adrian's elbow with a clipboard. They spoke in low tones that I could not hear from my position, but I watched Adrian's face as he reviewed whatever Gavin was showing him. His expression did not change. Not when he turned a page, not when Gavin pointed toward the back corridor, not when he looked up and scanned the room again with those composed, intelligent eyes. Then his gaze passed over me. 1 second, maybe less. The particular non-look of a man whose eyes move across a room full of people he has already decided are interchangeable. My own son looked at me and saw furniture. I kept my hands moving. I kept my breathing even. I kept the tightness in my chest exactly where it needed to stay, contained, compressed, useful. Then Gavin said something to Adrian and pointed toward the far end of the room, and Adrian turned and walked in that direction, and I heard clearly without ambiguity the words Gavin used to describe the previous evening's situation with David. Number 14, rack incident, account updated. Adrian said without breaking stride, "What's his current balance?" Gavin checked the clipboard. 42 days equivalent. Adrian considered this for perhaps 2 seconds. Reduce his rations until it's cleared. He works harder when he's uncomfortable. He said it the way you discuss adjusting a variable in a system, not with cruelty, not with pleasure, with the flat efficiency of someone optimizing an outcome. Reduce his rations. David was 23 years old and had been in this facility for 43 days, and my son had just decided he should eat less because he had knocked over a rack of sheet trays. Something happened inside my chest that I had no name for. It was not anger exactly. Anger was something I had felt in boardrooms and courtrooms and negotiations gone wrong. This was older than anger. Heavier. The specific grief of a parent who has searched a child's face for something familiar and found only a stranger looking back. I had raised this man. I had held him the night he was born in a hospital on the corner of Belmont and West Haven. I had taught him to ride a bicycle in the parking lot behind our first office building. I had sat with him through the nights when Catherine was sick and he could not find a way to say what he was feeling. And I had told him that sometimes presence was enough, that sometimes you didn't need the right words, you just needed to stay. I had stayed, and he had built this. Across the room, David received the news about his rations from Gavin with a stillness that was more terrible than any reaction could have been. He simply nodded and went back to work, and the nod was the nod of a man who had stopped being surprised by the ways this place could find to take more from him. Adrienne rode the elevator back up at 11:15. The room did not relax when he left. That was perhaps the worst thing, that his absence did not restore anything, because what he had taken with him when he arrived was not something the room had been holding in reserve. It was something that had been gone for a long time already. I pressed my forearm against my side and thought about the GPS strip and Marcus and everything that needed to happen before another morning arrived in this windowless place. Tonight, I decided. It had to be tonight. The afternoon shift ran the way the morning shift had run, without variation, without relief, with the grinding sameness that was itself a kind of strategy. I had come to understand over these 2 days that the monotony was not incidental. It was designed. A man whose days were identical stopped measuring time in hours and started measuring it in tasks. And a man measuring time in tasks stopped thinking about the world outside. And a man who stopped thinking about the world outside became gradually, and without drama, exactly the kind of person this facility needed him to be. Compliant. Efficient. Present only in the immediate and the physical. I refused to let that happen. Every hour I returned deliberately to the same set of facts, 23 names on a folded piece of paper. A GPS strip on my forearm. Marcus in a vehicle somewhere above me. A button on my jacket that had been recording since 4 o'clock the previous afternoon. Tonight. At 2 in the afternoon, Gavin moved through the room, conducting what I had come to recognize as his inventory check, not of equipment, but of people. He walked the stations, counted heads, made notations on his clipboard. When he reached the prep station, he stopped. 14, he said. David looked up from his work. He was thinner than he had seemed yesterday, or perhaps I was simply paying more attention. Anyone in Sector B with an outstanding account balance eats at reduced portions until the balance is cleared. Anyone without an outstanding balance, he paused just long enough to make the next word land, eats normally. He moved on. The effect was immediate and devastating in its quietness. Men at neighboring stations exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. The calculation of who was in Sector B, who had accumulated debt, who would be affected. Dennis beside me exhaled through his nose with the controlled fury of a man who had decided that controlled fury was the only kind he could afford. Sector B is 2/3 of the facility, he said very quietly. I know, I said. David is in Sector B. I know. Dennis set down the item in his hands, with more care than the situation required, the careful movements of someone managing something that wanted very much to be uncareful. That boy has been here 43 days, he said. He came in here owing nothing. Everything on his account was put there by them. I thought about the ledger in Gavin's office. 3rd door back corridor. Combination padlock starting with a 1. Tonight. At 3:45, the incident I had been half expecting since morning finally arrived. Gavin was at the far end of the room near the loading dock, when one of his floor staff, a younger man, whose name I had not learned, came in from the back corridor and handed him a phone. Not a facility phone. A personal cell phone, old model, the screen cracked at one corner. Gavin looked at it. Then he looked up, scanning the room with the particular attention of someone who has just been handed a problem. This was found in the back corridor, he said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. Under a mattress. He held it up. Whose is this? Nobody spoke. Gavin waited. His patience in these moments was one of the most unpleasant things about him. He never seemed to need resolution quickly, which meant he could outlast almost any silence. Jonathan at the station behind me was very still. I did not look at him. I kept my hands moving and my breathing even, and I thought with cold clarity, if Gavin identifies that phone as Jonathan's, everything accelerates in the wrong direction. Jonathan becomes a problem. Problems in this facility got managed in ways I had not witnessed directly, but had understood from every conversation in the past 2 days. Then, without planning it, I turned around. It might be mine, I said. Every head in the room turned toward me. Gavin looked at me with the flat, assessing attention of a man recalibrating. Yours. I had a phone when I came in, I said. Old one. I thought they took it at the door. They did, Gavin said. Then maybe I had too. I met his gaze without flinching. I'm old. I forget things. The room was absolutely still. Somewhere behind me I could feel Jonathan not breathing. Gavin walked toward me, slowly holding the phone. When he reached my station, he held it out. Open it, he said. The screen was cracked. The phone was locked with a 4-digit PIN. I looked at it for 1 second, at the screen, at the crack, at the faint image of the lock screen wallpaper visible beneath the dark glass. A young woman in a graduation gown, standing beside an older man, both of them smiling with the particular joy of people who had worked very hard for a very long time to arrive at exactly this moment. Lily Reeves and Jonathan. I pressed the power button. The lock screen lit up. I looked at the keypad and made a decision based on nothing except the specific quality of hope that a father puts into a photograph he keeps on his phone. I typed the year a daughter graduates college. I guessed. I guessed based on Lily's apparent age, based on Jonathan's pride when he spoke her name, based on 40 years of reading people in rooms where the stakes were high. The phone unlocked. Gavin stared at it. I stared at it. The home screen was simple, a few apps, a wallpaper of the same photograph from the lock screen. But in the corner of the screen, a notification badge glowed on the Messages app. Unread. Recent. Gavin reached for the phone. I tilted it slightly, just enough, just for the half-second, before his hand closed around it to read the sender name on the notification. Lily R. And the first 3 words of the unread message, Dad. I found Gavin took the phone, looked at the home screen without opening the messages, and pocketed it. He looked at me for a long moment, with eyes that had moved past skepticism into something more careful. Next time you forget something, he said, it goes on your account. He walked away. Behind me, so quietly that only I could hear it, Jonathan exhaled a long, slow, shaking breath that carried 19 days of accumulated dread out into the recycled air of that underground room. I turned back to my station. My hands were not steady, and I did not try to make them so, because Rick Harlan was an old man who had just done something frightening, and old men who do frightening things are allowed to have unsteady hands. But my mind was steady, because Lily Reeves was not silent. Lily Reeves had found something, and she was trying to reach her father, and somewhere above ground, in a world that still had windows and weather, and the ordinary movement of days, she was still fighting, which meant I had to give her something to fight toward. Tonight, I thought again. It had to be tonight. At 8:50 in the evening, I began preparing. Not visibly. There was nothing to see and no movement that differed from the ordinary settling of a man onto a cot. At the end of a long day, no action that would have registered on any of the 4 cameras Walter had identified. What I was preparing existed entirely in the space behind my eyes, in the careful sequencing of steps that needed to happen in a specific order, and could not be undone once they began. The facility had gone into its nighttime rhythm. Gavin had made his 7:45 call and retreated. The second shift man, younger, less attentive, a detail I had filed on my first evening, had made his 10:30 round and returned to whatever room he occupied at the far end of the administrative corridor. The lights were dimmed. The dishwashers above were running. 9 o'clock was 4 minutes away. Walter appeared at the edge of my cot with the unhurried ease of a man taking a late-night walk to nowhere in particular. He sat on the adjacent cot without being invited, which was the closest thing to ceremony that our arrangement allowed. "You're going tonight," he said. "The office," I said. "The ledger." He nodded slowly. 90 seconds when the circuit drops. 3rd door back corridor. Combination starts with a 1. He paused. "I've been thinking about the 2nd digit. What did you decide? 9. He said it with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent considerable time with a problem and arrived at a conclusion he trusted. "Gavin has a daughter. Her name is on a photograph on his desk. I saw it once when the office door was open. She looks about 9 years old. Men like Gavin use dates and ages, numbers with meaning." He looked at me steadily. 1 9 and then 2 more digits. I don't know the last two. I thought about what I knew of Gavin, the clipboard, the notebook, the methodical patience. Men who kept records that carefully tended to use combinations they could remember under pressure. Simple progressions. Patterns. 1911, I said. Walter considered this. Why? Because 1911 is the kind of number a man uses when he wants to feel like history is on his side. Walter looked at me for a moment with an expression that contained, just briefly, something close to amusement. You're a strange man, Rick. You have no idea, I said. At precisely 9 o'clock, the lights flickered. It lasted 3 seconds, a barely perceptible dimming, a soft stutter in the fluorescent hum above, and then stability returning as the system compensated. 90 seconds of darkness in the back corridor camera. Walter had been right about the timing to the minute. I moved. The back corridor was 15 feet, then 30, the narrow passage darker than the main room, and smelling of concrete, and the particular staleness of recycled air that had been moving through the same system for too long. Third door on the left. The padlock was exactly as Walter had described. Standard combination, 4 digits, the kind sold at any hardware store in America for under $15, which said something specific about the confidence of a man who believed nobody would ever get close enough to try it. 1 9 1 1. The lock opened. The office was small, a desk, a filing cabinet, a lamp, a folding chair. The photograph of Gavin's daughter was on the desk exactly where Walter had said it would be, turned slightly toward the door, the way people turn photographs when they want them visible from wherever they spend their time. She was blonde, gap-toothed, grinning, with the uncomplicated joy of a child who did not yet know what her father did for a living. I found the ledger in the top drawer of the filing cabinet. It was a standard composition notebook, black cover, college-ruled pages, the kind that cost $2 at any drugstore. But inside it was a complete record of every man in the facility. Numbers, not names. Account balances in one column, daily output, assessments in another, medical notations. In a third, not because anyone here received medical care, but because injuries and illnesses affected productivity, and productivity was what the ledger tracked. 23 entries, 19 with outstanding balances, 4 with balances that had been growing for so long that the numbers had moved into a range no reasonable person could ever work off. I pressed the button on my jacket 2 seconds steady and held the ledger open in front of me, turning the pages slowly, giving the camera every line. Then I returned the ledger to the drawer exactly as I had found it, and I pressed my left forearm against my ribs. The GPS strip was warm against my skin. I pressed it firmly 3 times, the emergency activation sequence Marcus and I had agreed upon before I went in. 3 pulses meant I have what we need. I have evidence. Begin coordination. I waited. The strip did not respond. No vibration, no confirmation pulse. Nothing. I pressed again. 3 times. Steady. Nothing. The interference Walter had warned me about, the signal dampening built into the facility's security system, was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. My 3 pulses were leaving my forearm and traveling perhaps 6 inches before dissolving into the electronic noise of a building that had been specifically engineered to prevent exactly this kind of communication. I stood in Gavin's office in the dark and felt for the first time since I had walked onto the corner of Halsted and Meridian something very close to fear, not for myself. I want to be clear about that, because I have examined the memory carefully, and I am certain of what I felt. The fear was not for Richard Cole. Richard Cole was 70 years old and had already built everything he was going to build and had already lost the thing that mattered most, and had already made his peace with the arithmetic of what remained. The fear was for 23 other people. For Dennis Okafor, who had a wife named Patricia and a daughter who had just turned 4. For David, who had been here 43 days and was now eating less than before. For Jonathan, who had absorbed 19 days of manufactured debt to protect strangers and whose daughter was somewhere above ground, sending messages that began with Dad. I returned to my cot. At 10:15, I lay in the dark and thought about Marcus Webb, who had worked for my family for 22 years, who drove carefully in rain and knew without being told when to stay close and when to give space, who had looked at me across my own desk 3 days ago with the expression of a man who understood exactly how dangerous this was and had chosen to help anyway. Marcus was out there, 300 feet of concrete and interference above me. He had half a GPS signal, enough to know the general area, not enough to know the floor, not enough to act. What he did not have yet, I realized, was a reason to act that would hold up when it mattered. Then, at 10:40, my understanding of the situation changed completely. Because the second shift man came through the main room, with unusual speed, not running, but moving with the particular urgency of someone who has just received information that requires immediate delivery, and went directly to the administrative corridor without making his usual round. 2 minutes later, from behind the closed door at the far end of the corridor, I heard Gavin's voice, raised, controlled but raised, which was the first time I had heard either of those things from him, and then faintly the sound of a phone call being placed. I pressed my forearm against my ribs one more time. Nothing. But somewhere above me, I had to believe Marcus was already moving. I did not sleep again that night. I lay on the cot and I thought, which was all I had available to me, and I thought carefully, and in order the way I had trained myself to think during the worst moments of 40 years in business, not about what I feared, but about what I knew and what I could reasonably infer from what I knew, and what the gap between those two things required me to do. What I knew, Gavin had received information at 10:40 that caused him to raise his voice and make a phone call. The phone call had lasted approximately 4 minutes, based on the sound of his voice through the corridor wall. I had heard the beginning and the end, but not the content. Whatever he had learned had not yet produced a visible response in the facility itself. The lights had not changed. No one had entered the main room. The second shift man had resumed his ordinary rounds at 11:15, which meant the information was being processed somewhere above me, and the response was being organized, and I was lying on a cot with a GPS strip that could not transmit, and a button camera that had been recording for 31 hours, and a folded piece of paper in my boot that contained the names of 23 people who deserved better than this room. I needed Marcus to move, and Marcus could not move without a signal he had not yet received. What I could infer, the phone call Gavin made at 10:40 had gone upward in the organization. Not to appear, the duration was wrong for appear, and the raised voice at the beginning suggested Gavin had been reporting something unexpected to someone whose opinion of unexpected things mattered to him. Which meant Adrian now knew something had changed in the facility, and Adrian would respond the way men like Adrian responded to uncertainty, by tightening control. Morning would bring a different kind of day. I was right. At 6:45, instead of Gavin's ordinary footsteps, the main room received 3 people. Gavin, the second shift man, and a third individual I had not seen before. Broad-shouldered, moving with the particular efficiency of someone brought in specifically for a situation, rather than for ongoing operations. He stationed himself near the freight elevator without explanation and remained there. The morning shift began, but differently. Men were directed to stations by name, by number, rather than allowed to find their own positions. The keypad door remained closed. The water break at 10 was canceled without announcement, replaced by a brief distribution of cups at each station. At 8:15, Gavin stood in the center of the room and held up a small device, rectangular black, the size of a deck of playing cards. "We detected an unauthorized transmission from inside this facility last night," he said. His voice was exactly as level as it always was, which was more frightening than if it hadn't been. "The source has not been identified. Until it is, this facility is in lockdown. No one leaves a station without direct instruction. Personal items will be inspected." The room absorbed this information in the way rooms absorb bad news, without sound, without visible reaction, with the particular stillness of people who have learned that visible reaction is its own kind of risk. Dennis beside me did not move, but I felt the change in his breathing, the slight shortening, the controlled effort of a man keeping himself calm through a situation that had just become significantly more dangerous. Walter at his station across the room met my eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he looked away. The inspections began at 8:30. Gavin moved through the room methodically, every station, every man pockets emptied onto work surfaces, jackets removed and examined, boots checked. He was looking for a transmitter. He had a detector, and he was using it, passing it slowly over each man's body and clothing, with the patience of someone who trusted his equipment and his process. He reached me at 8:52. I had thought about this moment throughout the night. The GPS strip on my forearm was low frequency, designed to pass through most interference, but a handheld detector at close range was a different instrument than a building's passive dampening system. Walter had told me the cameras covered the northeast corner. The detector would find the strip if Gavin passed it close enough to my left arm. "Jacket," Gavin said. I removed it and laid it on the work surface. He ran the detector over it slowly. The button camera was passive when not actively transmitting. Gloria had been specific about this. It emitted nothing when in storage mode, only when the 2-second activation was pressed. It had been in storage mode since I returned from the office. The detector passed over the second button without response. Then he moved the detector toward my left arm. The strip was 3 inches below my inner elbow, adhered flat to the skin, no thicker than a bandage. The detector moved upward from my wrist. 2 inches. 1 inch. Jonathan Reeves, 2 stations down, dropped an entire tray of equipment. The sound was enormous, the same cascading crash that David had produced 2 days earlier, amplified in the lockdown silence of a room where everyone was holding their breath. Every head turned. Gavin's head turned. The detector moved away from my arm as Gavin straightened and looked toward the source of the sound. Jonathan was on his knee, collecting the scattered items with hands that were shaking visibly, genuinely shaking. Not performance, the shaking of a 68-year-old man who had made a deliberate decision to fall apart at a specific moment and was experiencing the full physical reality of that decision. Gavin crossed to him. I pressed my sleeve down over the GPS strip with my right hand and put my jacket back on. My heart was striking my ribs so forcefully that I could feel it in my throat. I breathed through it. I kept my hands moving. I kept Rick Harlan exactly where he needed to be. Gavin stood over Jonathan for a long moment, looking down at him with the flat attention of a man calculating whether this was incompetence or something else. Jonathan looked up at him with the exhausted, slightly unfocused eyes of a man who had not been sleeping well for 19 days and had simply lost his grip on a tray. Nothing more. Gavin made a notation in his book and moved on. When the inspections were complete and Gavin had retreated to the administrative corridor, I allowed myself 1 full minute of simply standing at my station and letting the accumulated tension of the past 20 minutes move through me and out. Then I thought about what Gavin had said. Unauthorized transmission. Detected last night. Not my GPS that had failed to transmit. not my button camera that had been in storage mode, which meant something else had transmitted last night from inside this facility. Lily's message. The phone Gavin had taken from me the previous afternoon, the phone he had pocketed without checking the messages, had apparently attempted to send or receive a transmission after he took it. An automatic sync. A delayed message delivery. Something that the facility's system had flagged as unauthorized. Gavin had the phone. He had not read the messages, but the attempt to communicate had been detected, and now the facility was in lockdown, and somewhere in Gavin's pocket was a message from Lily Reeves that began with "Dad, I found." And somewhere above ground, I had to believe Marcus had received enough. Because 22 years of working for Richard Cole had taught Marcus Webb one thing above all others: when the signal goes quiet and the building goes dark, and the man inside stops reaching out, you do not wait for permission. You move. Before I reveal the shocking exposure and face-to-face confrontation coming up next, please comment. Number 1, so I know you're still here following the story. Also, please note the upcoming events include some fictional elements added for dramatic effect and may not fully reflect reality. If you prefer not to listen to these dark corners, you can turn off the video right now. The lockdown changed the texture of the facility in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Before, the oppressiveness had been structural, built into the architecture of the place, into its routines and its ledgers, and its careful management of what people ate and how long they stayed. It had been the oppressiveness of a system, which is a particular kind of weight, because it does not require anyone to be actively cruel at any given moment. The system does the work. The people inside it simply maintain their assigned positions. After the lockdown, it became personal. Gavin moved through the room more frequently. The third man, the broad-shouldered one who had stationed himself near the freight elevator since morning, began walking the perimeter of the main room at irregular intervals, which was worse than regular intervals because irregularity cannot be anticipated, and things that cannot be anticipated cannot be prepared for. Men at stations worked with the particular rigidity of people who were aware in every moment of being watched by someone who was looking for a reason. I worked, and I thought, and I waited. At 10:30, Gavin called Jonathan out of the back corridor. I heard it from my station. Gavin's voice level and unhurried as always, saying number 21 front room, and the sound of Jonathan's footsteps moving through the corridor toward the main space. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, looking exactly as he always looked, unhurried, deliberate, the face of a man who had thought carefully about most things. But I had spent enough time watching Jonathan Reeves to know the difference between his ordinary stillness and the stillness he wore when he was managing something difficult. This was the second kind. Gavin was standing in the center of the room with his clipboard. "Last night's incident," he said to Jonathan specifically, in a voice that carried clearly across the room. "The tray, that goes on your account." Jonathan nodded once. "Understood." "Your current balance," Gavin said, consulting the clipboard, "is now at 61 days equivalent." The number landed in the room like something heavy dropped from a height. 61 days. At the daily rate this facility assigned to its workers, 61 days equivalent debt was not something a man could work off in any reasonable time frame. It was the kind of number that had been designed not to be paid, but to be carried indefinitely as a permanent condition of presence. Jonathan's face did not change. That was the thing that broke something open in my chest, not the number, not Gavin's tone, not the calculated injustice of punishing a man for the thing he had done specifically to protect someone else. It was Jonathan's face. The absolute, practiced stillness of a man who had been absorbing manufactured blows for 19 days and had decided somewhere along the way that dignity required him not to flinch. He was 68 years old. He had a daughter named Lily, who was trying to reach him with a message that began, "Dad, I found," and he was standing in an underground room, being told he owed 61 days to a system that had never had any legal claim on a single hour of his time. Gavin made the notation in his book. Then he said, "Additionally, the tray incident during the inspection this morning constitutes deliberate interference with facility security procedures. That carries a separate penalty." He looked up from the clipboard. "Effective today, number 21 is reassigned to Sector B. Sector B, reduced rations. The same sector where David had been eating less than he needed for 2 days already." Jonathan nodded again. Still no flinch. Still the same careful, deliberate stillness. And something that had been compressed in my chest for 2.5 days, compressed and controlled and managed, and kept exactly where it needed to be for the sake of 23 people who needed Rick Harlan to stay in place, reached the end of what compression could contain. I put down the item in my hands. Walter's head turned toward me immediately. His eyes said with great clarity and no words at all, "Do not." I heard him. I understood him. I knew with complete precision what he was telling me and why he was right and what the consequences of ignoring him were likely to be. I stood up anyway. "That's enough," I said. The room went absolutely still. Not the ordinary stillness of people being careful, the total stillness of people who have just heard something they did not expect and are trying to determine what it means. Gavin turned. He looked at me with the flat, assessing attention I had seen him direct at problems that required management. "Number 7, he said. "Sit down." "No," I said. The broad-shouldered man near the elevator took a step forward. I reached up and took hold of the prosthetic beard at the jawline. Gloria had told me the release point, shown me how to remove it cleanly, walked me through the process in her workroom on Delancey Street, as if she had known this moment was coming, and I pulled it free in one motion. Then I took the cloth from my back pocket and wiped my face. Not completely. Not the deep pigmentation around my eyes, not the prosthetic lines at my temples, but enough. Enough to show the structure of a face that had appeared on the covers of business magazines and the walls of conference rooms and the lobby portrait of the Cole Tower for 40 years. Gavin stared at me. The room stared at me. Dennis Okafor, at the station to my left, made a sound that was not quite a word, a short, involuntary exhale of recognition and disbelief compressed into a single breath. Walter sat very still with his hands flat on his work surface and his eyes on Gavin, and the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had decided when it did to be ready. "My name," I said into the silence of that underground room, "is Richard Cole." I let that settle for exactly the time it needed. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Cole Dominion Holdings, the company that owns this building. The company that owns the restaurant above us. The company that employed every person in this room before they were brought down here. I looked at Gavin steadily. "And I have been recording everything in this facility since 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon." Gavin's expression did not change. That was the most frightening response he could have given, not shock, not anger, not the collapse of composure that would have indicated the situation was resolving in my favor. Just the same flat, assessing attention, recalibrating, calculating, deciding. "Sir," he said after a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment. He said it the way you say a word when you are buying time rather than communicating. I pressed my forearm against my ribs one final time. The GPS strip sent nothing, but I had stopped needing it to. Because Jonathan Reeves was looking at me not with gratitude, not with relief, but with the specific expression of a man who has been waiting 19 days for something to change and has just watched it begin, and that expression was worth every hour of the past 2.5 days. "I suggest I said to Gavin, that you think very carefully about what happens next. Gavin made the call at 10:53. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock on the wall behind his left shoulder. An ordinary wall clock, battery-powered, the kind that costs $8 at a drugstore, which was perhaps the most ordinary object in an extraordinary room. Gavin stepped away from me, turned his back, spoke into his phone for 90 seconds, and then returned the phone to his pocket, with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had reported a situation and was now waiting for instructions. The room waited with him. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The broad-shouldered man near the elevator had taken a position that was closer to me than before, not threatening in any visible way, just present the way a door is present, when someone wants to make sure you understand it is closed. Walter sat at his station with his hands flat on the work surface. Dennis stood at the prep area with his eyes forward and his jaw set. Jonathan had returned to his position in the back corridor, which I knew because I had watched him walk there after Gavin dismissed him. Walking with the same unhurried dignity he had carried into the room, unchanged by what had just happened, unbowed by the number 61 written next to his name in a ledger that had no legal standing and never had. 14 minutes after Gavin made the call, the freight elevator descended. I heard it the same way I had heard it on the previous morning. The slower movement of additional weight. The particular mechanical patience of a system being asked to carry more than equipment. The doors opened. The two men in dark clothing stepped out first. The same ones who had preceded Adrian on his previous visit, and they moved to positions on either side of the elevator, rather than into the room, which told me something about the nature of the visit that was coming. Adrian Cole stepped out of the elevator at 11:07 in the morning. He was not wearing a suit today. Dark trousers, a charcoal sweater, the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, the clothing of a man who had been reached at a moment he had not prepared for, and had not taken the time to fully prepare for this one either. His face, as he crossed the room toward me, was composed in the way that faces are composed when composure is a decision rather than a condition. He stopped 4 feet away. For a long moment, he simply looked at me, at the remaining prosthetics, at the work clothes, at the coat Gloria had treated on Delancey Street 3 days ago. He looked at his father standing in a room beneath his restaurant, wearing the costume of a man his system was designed to make invisible. "Dad," he said. One word. Not a greeting, not an apology, not shock, not guilt, not the beginning of an explanation. Just the word itself, spoken in the tone of a man who was still processing what the word meant in this particular context. "Adrian," I said. He looked around the room. At the men at their stations, at Gavin standing nearby at the freight elevator, and the low ceiling, and the fluorescent lights. He looked at it the way you look at something you built when you are suddenly seeing it through someone else's eyes, not seeing it differently exactly, but aware for the first time that it can be seen differently. "You should not be here," he said. "No," I agreed. "Neither should any of these men." Something moved across his face, not guilt. I want to be precise about that, because guilt requires a moral framework that registers an action as wrong, and what I saw on my son's face in that moment was not guilt. It was inconvenience. The particular tightening of a man who has encountered an obstacle he had not accounted for in an otherwise functional plan. That was the moment I understood, with a completeness that no earlier evidence had quite produced, that the son I had been hoping to find somewhere beneath this operation was not here. He had not been detained or deceived or led astray by circumstances. He had made choices, each one deliberate, each one building on the last, across a period of time long enough that the choices had become character. "The recording," Adrian said to Gavin, rather than to me. "Button camera," Gavin said. "Active since yesterday afternoon. Recovered, not yet." Adrian looked back at me. You understand that a recording made through illegal entry into a private facility has significant legal complications. I understand corporate law reasonably well, I said. I also understand that I did not enter illegally. I responded to a public labor solicitation, accepted offered employment, and reported to a worksite. Everything that happened after that is on the recording. I held his gaze, including this conversation. Something shifted in his expression. Not the inconvenience this time, something older and less manageable. He looked at me the way people look at things they have been avoiding looking at directly, and I thought for one moment that the son I knew was in there somewhere, looking back at me through the composed and calculated surface of the man he had become. Then the moment closed. "Secure the facility," Adrian said to Gavin. "Nobody leaves. Retrieve the recording device." He paused. "My father stays here until I've spoken with legal." The words entered me quietly and found every room I had built over 70 years. My son had just ordered his own father detained in a basement. I did not respond with anger. I want to be clear about that, because anger would have been easier. Anger has momentum. Anger produces action. Anger is a feeling that knows what to do with itself. What I felt was something slower and heavier than anger. It was grief, I think. The grief of a man who has built something over 40 years and is watching it matter less than he thought it did in the moment that was always going to be the test of whether it mattered at all. "Adrian," I said. He had already turned toward the elevator. "Adrian." He stopped. He did not turn around. "Your mother would not recognize you," I said. The room held its breath. Adrian's shoulders rose slightly, one breath contained controlled, and then he stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed, and he was gone. "Richard," the voice said. "Richard, is that you?" Sandra Cole appeared in the doorway of the main room. She was wearing a volunteer lanyard, the blue and white one Adrian had apparently issued to everyone involved in his workforce development program. And she was carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of a woman whose entire understanding of the past 2 months had just been revised in the span of 30 seconds. She looked at the room, at the men at their stations, at the cots visible through the back corridor door, at the work surfaces and the freight elevator and the low ceiling and the fluorescent lights that never changed. Then she looked at me, at her brother in work clothes and partial prosthetics, standing in the middle of a room she had believed was something entirely different. "Oh, Richard," she said. Her voice broke on my name in a way that contained everything she had just understood and could not yet say. "Oh, what has he done?" Her clipboard fell from her hands and clattered on the concrete floor, and she pressed both palms flat against her mouth, and I watched my sister understand in real time that the kindness she had believed she was part of had never been kindness at all. The 40 minutes after Adrian left were the longest of my life. Not because of what was happening in the visible physical sense, very little was happening. Gavin had stationed the broad-shouldered man near the loading dock and retreated to the administrative corridor. The second shift man stood near the keypad door. The workers at their stations continued working because there was nothing else available to them, and because the habit of work once established persists even when everything around it has changed. I stood at my station, and I waited, and I thought about Marcus. I thought about the missing persons report Patricia Okafor had filed 3 times and been turned away from 3 times, filed 18 hours before I had entered Gloria's workroom on Delancey Street, which meant it had been in the system for nearly 3 full days. I thought about Eleanor Marsh, who had worked as Coal Dominion's internal legal counsel for 14 years and kept every signed document that had ever passed through the company's formal channels, including signature exemplars for every officer, including me going back to the founding. I thought about the forged transfer documents Adrian had apparently sent to Marcus as a warning timed to arrive after I was already inside, and about what Eleanor would have said when Marcus called her at whatever hour of the previous night he had called her. Eleanor Marsh did not believe in warnings. She believed in records. She would have compared the signature on the transfer documents to 14 years of exemplars within the hour. She would have found the discrepancies the specific tell of a signature reproduced from a scanned image rather than signed in motion within 20 minutes of that. She would have called the U.S. Attorney's Office, not the local police, because Eleanor understood jurisdiction, and Eleanor would have known that labor exploitation at the scale of this facility was a federal matter under Title 18, which meant federal agents, which meant resources and authority that did not depend on any local chain of command that Adrian might have had occasion to cultivate. I thought about all of this, and I waited, and I kept my hands moving, and I kept Rick Harlan in place for what I knew was the last time. Sandra had not left the room. After the clipboard had fallen, and she had pressed her hands to her mouth, she had stood in the doorway for a long moment, long enough for several things to happen visibly on her face, none of which I had ever seen there before, in 61 years of knowing her. Shock first, then the specific grief of someone who has just understood they were used. Then something that settled into the particular stillness of a woman who had decided what she was going to do next. She picked up the clipboard. She walked to the nearest workstation, Dennis's station as it happened, and she stood beside him and she said quietly, and without drama, "Tell me what I can do." Dennis looked at her for a long moment, with the assessing attention of a man who had learned not to extend trust quickly. Then he said, "There are men in the back room who haven't had enough water today." Sandra nodded and went to find water. That was Sandra Cole, 61 years old, betrayed by her nephew, standing in an underground room she had believed was something else entirely, choosing in the span of 30 seconds to be useful rather than devastated. I had known her for her entire life, and I had never been more proud of her than I was in that moment, watching her walk down the back corridor with the purposeful stride of someone who had converted shock into action without stopping to grieve first. At 11:49, the loading dock door opened. Not the freight elevator, not the keypad door. The loading dock, the heavy roll-up door at the base of the access ramp, through which the van had brought us 3 days ago, opened from the outside with the kind of decisive mechanical certainty that is different from the way doors open when someone on the inside operates them. Gavin heard it before I did. His footsteps in the administrative corridor stopped, then accelerated. Then the door to the corridor opened, and he came through it, moving faster than I had ever seen him move, and his face had the expression of a man whose calculations had just been invalidated by information he had not accounted for. He did not reach the loading dock, because the door was already open, and Marcus Webb was already through it. Marcus, who I had not seen in 3 days, and who looked in this moment exactly like what he was, a man who had spent 72 hours doing everything available to him with the resources available to him, and had arrived at the only conclusion that the situation permitted. He was followed by 4 federal agents in jackets that identified their agency clearly across the back, and 2 officers in the uniform of the city police department, and a woman in a dark suit carrying a leather document case that I recognized before I recognized her face. Eleanor Marsh. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent 14 years being the most prepared person in every room she entered, and had decided at some point to simply accept that as a permanent condition. She looked around the facility with the specific attention of someone conducting an inventory, and I could see her even from across the room noting and filing and organizing what she saw into the categories that would matter when this became a legal proceeding, which it was going to become, very soon, and for a very long time. The federal agents moved through the room with the practiced efficiency of people who had been briefed thoroughly and knew exactly what they were looking at. Gavin was directed to a position near the wall with his hands visible. The broad-shouldered man at the loading dock received the same direction. The second shift man appeared from the back corridor, saw the room, and stopped moving entirely. Marcus crossed the room to me. He looked at my face, at the partial prosthetics, the work clothes, the coat that still smelled of Gloria's mixture, and he exhaled through his nose with the slow, controlled relief of a man releasing something he had been carrying for 3 days. "Sir," he said. "Marcus," I said. He glanced around the room at the workers still at their stations, at Sandra emerging from the back corridor, with water cups, at Jonathan standing in the doorway of the back room, with the expression of a man who had been waiting 19 days for a door to open from the outside, and was still in the first seconds of its opening, not entirely certain it was real. "The warrant was approved at 2 this morning," Marcus said quietly. "Eleanor had the signature comparison ready by midnight. The U.S. Attorney's Office moved faster than I expected." He paused. "Miss Reeves, Lily Reeves, presented her documentation to the federal task force at 9 this morning. She had been building it for 3 weeks." Lily. She had not been silent. She had been building. "Adrian," I said. "Being detained upstairs," Marcus said. "He came down in the elevator 20 minutes ago with his personal attorney. The attorney is currently explaining to 2 federal agents why his client should not be considered a flight risk." He met my eyes. "It is not going well for the attorney." I looked around the room one final time at Dennis, who had his phone, and was calling a number he had been holding in his memory for 11 days, his whole body leaning toward the sound of the first ring. At Walter, who was sitting on his work stool with his arms folded, and the expression of a man who had kept count of 23 people across 12 days, and was watching with quiet satisfaction the count begin to change. At David, standing near the back corridor door, holding a cup of water Sandra had given him with both hands, as if it were something more valuable than water, which perhaps in that moment it was. At Jonathan, who had crossed the room and was standing in the open loading dock doorway, looking up the access ramp toward the rectangle of gray November sky visible at the top, his face turned toward the light, with the stillness of a man relearning something he had almost forgotten. Marcus held out an umbrella. I looked at it for a moment. Then I walked past it and up the ramp and out into the November air, because I had worn enough shelter for 3 days, and I wanted to feel the weather on my face. The November air was colder than I had remembered. 3 days underground had recalibrated something in my internal sense of temperature, and the gray Friday sky above the loading ramp felt in those first minutes almost aggressive in its ordinariness. The traffic sounds from the street 2 blocks over, a pigeon crossing the concrete near the base of the ramp, the distant noise of a city that had continued moving through its week without any knowledge of what had been happening beneath one of its commercial blocks. Marcus appeared at my shoulder 2 minutes after I came up. He did not speak immediately, which was one of the things I had always valued most about him. His understanding that some moments required presence before they required words. "Adrian is in the conference room on the 3rd floor," he said when enough time had passed. "His attorney is with him. The federal agents have indicated they will allow a brief conversation before the formal interview begins." He paused. "You don't have to." "I know," I said. I went up anyway. The 3rd floor of the building felt strange after the basement carpeted climate-controlled the kind of office environment designed to project stability and competence. The conference room was at the end of a corridor, its glass wall partially covered by interior blinds. Through the gap, I could see Adrian sitting at the table with his attorney beside him, both of them looking at documents, both of them performing the focused calm of people managing a situation they had decided not to panic about yet. A federal agent outside the door looked at me, looked at Marcus, and stepped aside. I went in. Adrian looked up. His attorney began to speak something about appropriate channels and legal representation, and Adrian put his hand on the man's arm, and the attorney stopped. We looked at each other across the conference table. my son and I. In a room that belonged to a building that belonged to a company that had started with blisters on my hands in a warehouse in Bridgeport, Connecticut, 40 years ago. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "The federal agents will do what they're going to do. Eleanor has the documentation. Lily Reeves has her records. The camera has 31 hours of footage." I sat down across from him. "I'm here because you are my son, and this is the last conversation we are going to have before everything changes, and I did not want it to happen through attorneys." Adrian was quiet. He looked older than he had in the basement. Not old. 42 was not old, but worn in the specific way that people look worn when the structure they have been maintaining collapses, and the effort of maintaining it is suddenly visible in their face. "You could have come to me," he said. "When you found the discrepancy, you could have called me into your office and asked me directly." "Yes," I said. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" I thought about the honest answer, which was not the comfortable one. "Because I was afraid of what you would say," I said, "and more afraid of what you wouldn't." Something crossed his face that I had not seen there in years. Not guilt. I had given up expecting guilt. Something more complicated. The expression of a man recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that the person across from him had been afraid too. "The people downstairs," I said. 23 of them. Dennis Okafor has a daughter who just turned 4. Jonathan Reeves has a daughter who spent 3 weeks building a case because she had no other way to reach her father. I held his gaze. Walter Briggs counted every one of them, every day, because he said someone should. Adrian looked at the table. "Someone should," I said again. "That is the thing I failed to teach you. Not the business, not the law, not the strategy." I leaned forward slightly. "That someone should. That when you are the person with the resources and the position and the power, someone should is always you." The room was very quiet. His attorney shifted in his chair but said nothing. Adrian did not look up for a long time. When he did, his eyes were the eyes of a man standing at the bottom of something very deep, looking up at the distance between where he was and where the light was, and understanding for the first time the full measurement of that distance. He did not speak. There was nothing left that words could usefully do. I stood up. "I'll cooperate fully with the investigation," I said. "The company will as well. Whatever restitution is determined, it will be paid." I looked at him one final time. "I love you. I have loved you since the night you were born in a hospital on the corner of Belmont and West Haven. That is not contingent on any of this." I paused at the door. But love is not the same as protection. I should have understood that difference earlier, and so should you. I walked out. Marcus was waiting in the corridor. He fell into step beside me without a word, which was exactly right. At the bottom of the stairwell, the lobby door opened, and Patricia Okafor came through it. She was smaller than I had imagined from the story of her standing outside my gate. Compact, determined, wearing a coat that was slightly too light for November, moving with the directness of a woman who had been told her husband was in this building and had not slowed down since. A federal agent was escorting her, but the agent was clearly following her rather than leading. She saw Dennis coming through a door at the far end of the lobby at the same moment he saw her. I stopped walking. Dennis crossed the lobby in the particular way that people cross rooms when the person on the other side is the person they have been holding in their mind for 11 days, not running, because running would have been insufficient, but moving with a focused entirety that made everything else in the room irrelevant. Patricia met him in the middle. She grabbed the front of his jacket with both hands and pressed her forehead against his chest, and her shoulders shook with the force of something that had been compressed for 11 days and was now finally allowed to be what it was. Dennis put both arms around her and closed his eyes. I looked away because some things are too private to witness even when you are standing in the same room, and because the sight of it had done something to my throat that I needed a moment to manage. Marcus put a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Sir," he said quietly, "Lily Reeves is outside." Lily Reeves was standing on the sidewalk outside the building's main entrance, which was around the corner from the loading ramp facing the street with her arms crossed against the November cold. She was in her late 20s, slight dark-haired, wearing a wool coat that was professional without being expensive and carrying a messenger bag with the strap across her chest, the way people carry things they have not put down in several days. She turned when she heard footsteps and looked at me with eyes that were simultaneously exhausted and extraordinarily alert, the eyes of someone who had been running on urgency for long enough that urgency had become its own kind of fuel. She looked at my face, at the remaining prosthetics, at the work clothes, and something moved across her expression that was more complicated than surprise. "You're him," she said. "Richard Cole." "Yes," I said. She studied me for a moment. "You were in there with him, with my father." "For 2 days, I said. "He protected me. More than once and without knowing who I was." Something happened in her face at that, a brief unguarded collapse of the composure she had been maintaining, a crack in the surface, through which I could see for just a moment the 28-year-old woman who had spent 3 weeks building a legal case against a corporation while simultaneously not knowing whether her father was safe. She pressed her lips together and looked at the street. "Is he?" she started. "He's fine," I said. "He's inside. A federal agent is with him. He has been offered water and a meal and a phone in that order, and when I left him, he was eating the meal and had already made 2 calls. I paused. "He asked about you first. Before the food, before anything else." Lily exhaled, not dramatically, but completely, the full body release of someone setting down something very heavy after a long carry. "He always does that," she said. Her voice was unsteady, but her eyes were steady, which told me something specific about the kind of person she was. "Asks about other people first, even when he's the one who needs asking about." "I know," I said. "I had 19 days' worth of evidence of that." We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, in the way that people stand when they have arrived at a point that neither of them was certain they would reach, and are still in the first seconds of reaching it, adjusting to the reality that it exists. "You built the case," I said. "Marcus told me. 3 weeks. Documentation records presented to the federal task force this morning." She nodded. "I found the shell company accounts first. Meridian Staffing. The payments matched the dates men were reported missing. I cross-referenced the missing persons filings for the past 8 months." She said it matter-of-factly, the way people describe work they have done when they are still too close to it for perspective. "I tried to go to HR first, then internal compliance. Then I was informed my position had been eliminated." "Your position was not eliminated," I said. "It was suppressed. There is a significant legal difference, and the company will be acknowledging that difference in writing within the week." She looked at me. "I am still the majority shareholder of Coal Dominion Holdings," I said. "The transfer documents were forged, which Eleanor Marsh established at 11:47 last night. Whatever else changes, and a great deal is going to change that has not." I held her gaze. "I would like to offer you the position of Director of Internal Audit. Permanent. Reporting directly to the board, not to any individual officer. Full authority to investigate any account, any division, any transaction." Lily was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to answer now," I said. "You don't have to answer at all. What you did, what you built over 3 weeks while not knowing where your father was, that stands regardless of anything else." "I'll answer now," she said. Her voice had steadied completely. Yes. I nodded. She looked back at the building entrance. Can I see him? I'll take you in myself, I said. We walked back toward the entrance together, and Marcus held the door, and Lily went through it with the focused directness of a woman who had been moving toward this door for 3 weeks and was not going to slow down now that it was open. I followed her inside and watched from the lobby as she went through the inner door toward the room where Jonathan was sitting, and I heard before the door closed fully behind her the sound of his voice saying her name, just her name. One word. But the way a father says a daughter's name when he has not been certain he would say it again, with everything compressed into a single syllable, all the days and the fear and the pride and the relief, none of it wasted, all of it present, landing exactly where it needed to land. I turned away from the door. Walter Briggs was standing near the lobby entrance coat on the folded newspaper from 3 days ago, tucked under his arm, apparently waiting for someone to tell him what happened next. He looked at me with the level, unhurried attention that I had come to understand was simply how Walter Briggs looked at the world. What now? He said. It was, I thought, the most reasonable question anyone had asked all day. Now, I said, someone drives you home. He considered this. I live in Rockford. Then someone drives you to Rockford. I looked at him steadily. And then when you are ready, if you are willing, I would like to speak with you about a permanent position overseeing facility operations at Coal Dominion. I paused. You kept count of 23 people for 12 days. I need someone who does that. Walter looked at me for a long moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating, once more, one final time, I hoped, though I suspected it was simply how he moved through the world and would continue to do so indefinitely. Rockford first, he said. Rockford first. I agreed. Marcus appeared with car keys. I stood in the lobby of the building that bore my name, and I thought about 40 years of building things and what it meant that the most important things I had found in 3 days underground were not leverage or evidence or legal strategy. They were a man who counted days, a woman who built cases in the dark, a father who asked about other people first, and a 23-year-old named David who held a cup of water with both hands. I thought about what I had built, and what I had failed to build, and what there was still time to build if I was careful about it and honest and paid attention to the right things. The lobby door opened. November air came through it, cold and plain and thoroughly ordinary. I walked toward it. Marcus drove me to the penthouse at 2:40 in the afternoon. I did not go inside immediately. I stood on the terrace on the 41st floor and looked out at the city, at the grid of streets and the particular gray-gold quality of November light moving across it all, and I let myself be still for the first time in 3 days. The coal tower was visible from where I stood. My name on the side of it, 40 stories of steel and glass, built on 40 years of decisions, some of them good, and some of them not, all of them made with the belief that what I was building mattered and would outlast me in ways that were worth the cost. I thought about Adrian as a boy 7 years old, walking the warehouse floor with me on a Saturday morning, asking questions I had not expected. Why do the workers need to see clearly? Because their work matters. He had nodded with the gravity of a child filing something important. He had heard the lesson. He had not understood it. And the gap between those two things had been my responsibility to close. I had given Adrian everything I built. I had not shown him carefully enough or often enough why any of it was worth having. That was the failure. Not the law, not the oversight. The failure was simpler and older and more personal than any of those things. Empires do not teach. Only people teach. Only presence teaches. Only the patient, unglamorous act of showing someone what you value by the way you spend your hours and treat the people in front of you, only that teaches. Walter Briggs had known it. He kept count of 23 people for 12 days because someone should, because somewhere in his 61 years, someone had shown him that it mattered. Jonathan Reeves had known it. He absorbed 19 days of manufactured hardship to protect strangers without announcement, without expectation, as if care were simply the baseline of how a person moves through the world. I had known it once. Catherine had known it always. I went inside. I sat at the desk where I had first opened the audit file, and I pulled out a legal pad and began to write, not a strategy, not a legal brief, a letter to Adrian. The kind you write not because you expect it to change anything immediately, but because some things need to be said in full in your own hand. I wrote for a long time. When I finished, I thought about my mother, who had told me near the end that the only measure of a life that held up under examination was not what you accumulated, but what you made possible for others. I had accumulated a great deal. I was only beginning to understand what I had made possible. I picked up the phone and called Patricia Okafor. She answered on the second ring. In the background, I could hear Dennis's voice and a child's voice, high and clear and utterly unconcerned with anything that had happened in the past 11 days, asking for something ordinary. A snack, a story, the particular reassurance that only a parent's presence provides. "Mrs. Okafor," I said. "I wanted to call personally, to say that I am sorry, and that it will not happen again." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Cole," she said, "my daughter has her father back." She said it simply the way people state the thing that matters most when they have decided it is enough. "Yes," I said. "She does." Outside, the November light was failing. 23 people who had been numbers in a ledger were tonight something else entirely. I had built an empire, but the only thing I had done this week that I was certain was worth the doing was go down into a basement and refuse to look away. The rest I thought I could learn. I believe God puts people in our path for reasons we cannot always see in the moment. Walter counted 23 names because someone should. Jonathan absorbed 19 days of hardship to protect strangers. Lily fought in the dark for 3 weeks without knowing if anyone was coming. Those 3 people taught me more about what a life is worth than 40 years of boardrooms ever did. If I could say one thing to anyone watching this, do not do what I did. Do not confuse providing for your family with being present for your family. Do not assume that love is understood simply because it is intended. The most painful form of family betrayal is not the one that happens to you. It is the one you accidentally made possible. I have seen what family revenge looks like from both sides now, as the father who had to reckon with a son's choices, and as the man who had to reckon with his own. Neither side is clean. Neither side walks away unchanged. My personal belief is this family betrayal breaks things that money cannot repair. And family revenge, even when it is just always costs more than you expect. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you. And if you believe that stories like this one matter, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. One final note. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for the purpose of reflection and understanding. If that is not the content you are looking for today, I respect that completely. There is no shame in choosing what is right for you. But if you are still here, I am glad you stayed.